weak head taker, mighty warrior champion.
Belegar Ironhammer, true king of air beings.
Snik, supreme ruler of 8 peaks.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the next Legendary Lord video, Belegar Ironhammer, which I know that a lot of you have been waiting a very long time for. Before we hop into this full steam ahead, I do want to take a moment to say that there are a lot of things with Belegar that his lore is very old, and it has gone through a significant amount of retcons. And so the goal in this video was to tell the most complete possible story for a character who has been around for many editions and is hundreds of years old and shows up in a ton of minor stories that aren't about him, but nonetheless can be pinpointed to a vague time in his timeline. So I strive very hard to try and make sure that the stories I tell are accurate to the lore, but there are also times in this video where there's a lot of really bizarre gaps and things that happen that needed to be filled in, so I did my best to do that while also making sure to tell the most accurate story possible. So there are going to be moments where there might be something that happens and there are things that I have to infer the information from or use context clues to fill in the blanks. But I just wanted to make sure to make a statement about that, just so there's not someone who watches the video and there's a part that comes up and they're like, I don't remember this exact thing happening in this exact wording, and can you give me a page number in a book? And I would have to be like, well, no, but if you look back at 6th edition on page what's and what, and then you go to 8th edition and look at page what's and what, and then you read Gotrek and Felix and look at page what's and what, like, I can then tell you that these things happened and I have to build a narrative around this and to tell a good story. So there are things that happen in this that I have to fill in a fair amount of blanks, but 95% of everything comes from a direct source. I just wanted to make a statement about that because I pride myself very heavily on trying to draw as much information as possible from the source material and spend weeks studying the books and looking for every little scrap of lore to make as complete and compelling and fun a story as possible. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer. So without further ado, let's begin. Hope is not a familiar concept to the dwarves. So much has been lost over the last few millennia. Hundreds of outposts and even full Karaks overwhelmed during the blood-soaked age known as the Goblin Wars. Many Longbeards mutter into their tankards that the golden era of the Dawi has passed, that the Karaz Ankor's days are numbered. Not all believe this, however, as the High King declares a new age has begun. One of reclamation and vengeance. An age of reckoning. No Dawi is more crucial to this statement than the most stubborn dwarf in all the realms. Belegar Ironhammer, son of Karagar, son of Mordenkrag of the line of Lun, rightful king of Vala Azra Ungol. For he is the true king of Karak 8 Peaks. To understand the recently crowned Dawi king, the tale must first start with that of his heritage. A mighty and royal line, the Angren clan traces their ancestry all the way back to that of the ancestor gods Grugni and Valea. Thus, it was only proper that they were chosen to be the rulers of Karak 8 Peaks, the greatest hold besides that of Karaz Ankor itself. Here, the Angren kings ruled over a prosperous realm for thousands of years, until the disastrous time of woes. Countless hordes of vile skavens swarmed up from the deepest pits, while a monstrous tide of greenskins assailed above ground in a bloody siege. Without hope of reinforcements, and scores of brave Dawi falling each day, King Lun had only one choice to save his people. With a heavy heart, he ordered the many treasure vaults and tombs be runically sealed, before leading out the surviving dwarfs in a great throng that fought its way to safety. As the sight of Karak 8 Peaks faded behind them, King Lun swore an oath that one day his line would return and take back their ancestral home. Millennia later, the one to finally fulfill that promise would arrive. Prince Belegar was born in Karaz Ankor, where many of the Angren clan had resettled after being forced from their home. He grew up within the Everpeak, learning to be a proper lord of the Dawi from the best instructors found in the capital. Despite this, the heir of Vala Azra Ungol developed quite a fierce reputation due to his hot-headed nature and pride. To say he suffered several biting reprimands from the legendarily fierce tongue of Crag the Grim is an understatement. Even the current High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer often ruminates upon a time centuries ago, when he was instructing Belegar using goblin captives for practice, only to discover that Ironhammer had butchered the entire reserve. When Thorgrim demanded an explanation, the young royal had simply shrugged and stated, "I want to kill Groby," much to his lord's surprise and amusement. Outside of his studies and participating often in grobkul, or goblin hunting, with the likes of Prince Cazador of Karak Azul and Uzkul Kadran, Belegar could always be found in the taverns of Karaz Ankor, listening to the Longbeards of the Angren clan. They spoke in mournful tones about their ancestral hold, the fall of Vala Azra Ungol, an often told story that became memorized by the prince while still a beardling, setting a burning ambition deep in his heart. Many brave Dawi whom were descended from Karak 8 Peaks set off on quests to reclaim some artifact or even the hold itself, but none returned. Each fallen clan's dwarf only strengthening Belegar's spirit until that ember of purpose became a raging inferno. Centuries passed in the blink of an eye, and soon Prince Belegar was no mere beardling any longer. He journeyed far afield with the throngs of Everpeak, taking war to the countless foes of the Dawi on blood-soaked battlefields. These experiences shaped his skill in war, for Belegar learned well to lead his clan against the greenskins of Death Pass and the Skaven that lurked in the Underway. Perhaps more famously, however, his reputation as a fierce warrior grew, as the heir of King Lun was not one to stand idly in the back lines giving orders. His skill at wielding Karangrund, or hammer and shield, was second to none in the whole of the Karaz Ankor. Full of pride and strong of arm, the prince proved himself worthy as the next in line to rule his clan, despite the heavy shame that haunted the Angren clan from the ghosts of history. Life continued as such in Karaz Ankor until the fateful day when Prince Belegar Ironhammer passed into the halls of the ancestors, and Belegar ascended to rule in his father's place. Although a somber occasion, the prince accepted his title as Lord of the Angren clan with typical dwarven stoicism, receiving the legendary Ironhammer as had the ruler of his clan since Karak 8 Peaks was founded millennia ago. With the hammer of Angren gripped in his hand, he wasted no time heading to the shrine of Grimnir, where Belegar swore bold oaths despite the hopelessness of his cause. He would reclaim the Queen of the Silver Depths. No matter how long it took, or what it may cost, the heir of Lun would take his rightful inheritance. In the following months, Belegar Ironhammer would meet with his lords and thanes within the smoky taverns of their youth, discussing plans over swiftly drained tankards. Maps were consulted while many oaths of fealty and secrecy were sworn as the first expedition was slowly crafted. Belegar knew better than any that no clan would assist in such a seemingly suicidal task as conquering Vala Azra Ungol. He would need to demonstrate that the fallen hold wasn't a cursed death trap, that it was indeed possible to penetrate its depths. So the first mission would be something manageable. A small band of skilled Dawi would infiltrate the ruins and claim whatever lost relics they could to bring back. Perhaps with such prizes, he could convince others to help him, especially the recently crowned High King Thorgrim, who had already given fiery oratories about an age of reckoning. The first band of Dawi was selected, dubbed by Belegar as the Grim Brotherhood, a name that would be proudly borne by the Dwarfs of Karak 8 Peaks ever afterwards. Among their number, the most noteworthy dwarf was Grunfin Goldfinder. Grunfin was an explorer from the Grey Mountain hold of Karak Norn, a rather odd dwarf who was obsessed with descending into and charting out fallen holds. It so happened that his fascination with Karak 8 Peaks was quite high, and thus the ranger had snuck into Vala Azrael Ungol on numerous occasions with success. While creeping through its crumbling halls, he had managed to map out much of the first and second deeps, finding numerous hidden pathways and undisturbed rune-sealed chambers. After leaving the 8 Peaks behind, the ranger had sped with all haste to Karaz Ankor, where he found gainful employ with Belegar before leaving to scout the further deeps alone. Sadly, that was the last time anyone saw Grunfin Goldfinder. At long last, after months of preparation, the time had come for the Angren clan to visit their ancestral home. Before departing, Belegar was gifted with a runic shield by the elders of his clan. Known as the Shield of Defiance, the prince's kin hoped that perhaps its powerful defensive runes would allow him to return safely. It didn't take long for the determined mountain folk to cross Death Pass, slipping past the greenskin hordes of Black Crag until they at last sighted the northern peaks of Vala Azrael Ungol. Tears streamed down the cheeks of the Angren Dawi as they sighted the beauty of Karak 8 Peaks. Belegar's determination hardening until even the legendary Grimbril armor of the White Dwarf would have been brittle in comparison. Grunfin's maps led the Grim Brotherhood swiftly into pass through the mountains that led down into the first deep. They carefully worked through the darkness until arriving at the first rune-sealed chamber. The runesmith of their band, Braknar son of Brangar, wasted no time. Raising up his rune staff with whispered words to Grugni and Valea, the wards upon the door flared and the vault opened. Within rested priceless treasures of the past, runic items thought forever lost, and tomes inscribed with forgotten lore. Belegar's grin widened. For the first time in 29 generations, his people would taste some measure of victory. This process repeated numerous times throughout the first and second deeps, the Grim Brotherhood butchering any Groby unfortunate enough to cross their path. It was in the second deep, however, that the prince had his greatest moment. The Dawi approached the final stash of their quest, using a secret door cleverly disguised as part of the walls to approach a great stair with rubble blocking their path. Unwilling to retreat just yet, Belegar ordered his kin to bring out the kegs of black powder they had brought for just an occasion. With a resounding boom, the stones exploded into the following room, much to the surprise of a Groby tribe that was performing some bizarre ritual. Prince Belegar couldn't help but feel a deep joy as he roared, charging into the infested den. Disoriented and surprised as they were, the night goblins were brutally slaughtered without mercy, though a few Dawi were wounded in the battle. Braknar's rune magic quickly healed them, however, and the company of Belegar claimed the remainder of their spoils. Although it pained Ironhammer deeply, the time had come to retreat to the safety of Everpeak. Angrily swearing to return and one day cleanse these halls of all goblin filth, the heir of Lun made his way out. So did the Grim Brotherhood complete their quest and slip out of Vala Azrael Ungol without losing one of their number. Ghosting through Uzkul Kadran, and arriving soon enough at the doors of Karaz Ankor. A great celebration was held that night in Belegar's honor, for he had done what was believed to be impossible. Many Longbeards wept openly as they reverently passed around the fabled lost treasures of Karak 8 Peaks, heirlooms at long last brought home into proper hands. The prince stood tall in the dining halls of Everpeak, his booming voice carrying the tale of the journey to all that would listen. He told of their victory, of skulking goblins slain by dwarf steel, and the beauty of the 8 Peaks in all their unmolested majesty. Among those Dawi raising their tankards to cheer or roaring in outrage at the descriptions of the lower deeps, many felt deep down that ambition which burned in Belegar, igniting in their own souls. For the Angren clan, the victory signaled one truth: the time for reckoning was indeed at hand. The second expedition to Vala Azrael Ungol began preparation that same evening, though due to all the excessive drinking, many of the initial goals were grossly ambitious, as some Dawi suggested reclaiming the entire colossal hold in but 6 months' time. When morning arrived, the mood and goals sobered up accordingly. Prince Belegar stated the next phase clearly. If the Dawi had any hope of reclaiming the hold, they would need to establish a defensive outpost from which to slowly clear out the filth. To delve into the deeps immediately would be suicide. Even with their superior skills and arms, the dwarves would surely be overwhelmed by attacks from above and below like their ancestors were. There was only one viable option. They would have to take the citadel in the surface city. It would afford them the necessary protection from all sources of attack, while allowing offensive strikes to clear out the deeps one at a time. After a few more months of negotiation and planning, the heir of Lund marched once more to the south with a small force. Their objective was straightforward. The Grim Brotherhood would scout out the citadel and set up a small forward base from which they could begin to fortify their position. Once entrenched, further throngs would immediately journey from Karaz Ankor to provide reinforcements. From here, it would be only a matter of time until Karak 8 Peaks was back in Dawi hands where it belonged. The initial march went well. Belegar's company once again led safely past the greenskins of Blackcrag by well-traveled rangers. Upon their arrival to Vala Azrael Ungol, the Dawi looked upon what remained of the surface city and scowled at the sacrilege scene. Where once had been a prosperous hold nestled in the basin of the 8 Peaks, now laid a series of pitiful ruins with many orc camps. The once mighty walls that had connected between each of the mountains to form an impenetrable barrier bore gaping wounds from 3,000 years of abuse and neglect. Just another series of wrongs to be avenged. Belegar led the Grim Brotherhood down into the valley. 300 skilled dwarfs from a myriad of clans prepared to avenge their ancestors. The orcs were caught unawares, the closest greenskins to the slope barely having time to notice the bearded figures charging towards them. Axes sent decapitated heads spinning away, while great hammers pulped vital organs, as the Dawi carved a red ruin into the camp. The first 100 Urk were discarded with ease, but the element of surprise was spent as war cries rang out across the city. Scores of greenskins began flooding in, larger brutes shoving their way to the front with chappas swinging. Belegar quickly issued orders for his kin to form a shield wall, the Dawi snapping into place with practice from countless battles. Although the line held against the initial charge, Prince Ironhammer saw that more greenskins were beginning to pour in from all sides. If they kept fighting against the orcs, it would only be a matter of time before they were surrounded, not to mention the horrors that would crawl out of the depths once the sun set. As the first of the Dawi began to be cut down, the heir of Lund knew they had failed. The citadel's doors were open and tantalizingly close, but with their current force, the dwarfs wouldn't be able to kill all the Urk and reinforce their position inside the hold, before being swarmed by Thagaraki and Groby. It pained Belegar deeply to admit it, but they needed to retreat now if there was going to be any hope of success. Slaying a colossal orc war boss with a flurry of blows from the hammer of Angrund, the prince roared for the Grim Brotherhood to fall back in good order, quickly up the slope of the mountain. Maintaining their formation, the warriors carefully began to retreat with shields raised, careful to protect their fellow clansdwarf from the wild strikes of the orcs. From further up, rangers and thunderers provided cover fire to buy precious moments. Beard bristling with rage, Belegar smashed in the skull of a final war boss with an overhead strike, as the dwarfs finally broke away into a narrower pass where the greenskins' superior numbers would serve them little. In a final act of spite, the remaining miners among the throng lined the path with their blasting charges to cover the Dawi's escape. The Grim Brotherhood quickly fell back towards Death Pass, as the resulting explosion and cave-in of the pass ensured no swift pursuit. The second expedition to Karak 8 Peaks had failed. The return to Karaz Ankor was a solemn event in many ways. Over 20 brave clansdwarfs had fell in battle with nothing of value to show for their sacrifice. Many longbeards in the capital tutted with disappointment as their endless grumblings about the folly of Prince Belegar's quest were proven true. Clearly, the first expedition had been a farce, an accident, and nothing more. All the clans without an ancestral tie to Vala Azrael Ungol swiftly rescinded their support from any future expeditions, lest more of their kin die on such a foolhardy task. The heir of Lun remained unconcerned by those who abandoned his cause, even the Dawi who now hated him for leading to the death of their sons and brothers. Although the heir of Lun could not deny that the second expedition had been a disaster, he entertained no idea other than preparing for a third. Even when his closest counsel suggested focusing on other duties, the only response given by the prince was a deep scowl. Belegar refused to allow any to dissuade him. Karak 8 Peaks would be his. It took roughly a decade for Ironhammer to rally the support he needed for a third expedition, as many considered him an outright Wazik by this point. The coffers of the Angrund clan had been thrown open to pay for contracts and a fair number of hill dwarfs, or Dawi as they're known, who were hired on with promises of pay and compensation of property, or even lordship once the 8 Peaks were recaptured. Belegar also eventually secured favorable deals with the Dawi of the Grey and Black Mountains, for over the course of long negotiations, those holds saw much of their own difficult history in Ironhammer's plight. Thus, a full throng was assembled. Well over 1,000 dwarfs gathered from across the old world to reclaim the City of Pillars. No great celebration was held this time as the heir of Lun marched out of Karaz Ankor. To most within the capital, this foolishness had grown old, though the prince noticed that observing their journey from a high balcony was the High King himself, Thorgrim Grudgebearer. Belegar couldn't say for certain what the High King's opinion on the expeditions were at this point, but that hardly mattered now. The greatly enlarged Grim Brotherhood made their way south towards Uzkul Kadrin, rangers scouting ahead for potential threats, while wagon trains of war machines rumbled behind. Much to Ironhammer's surprise, his scouts reported back before the throng had even entered Death Pass. Over the last decade, something had changed, for the pass was choked with hordes of greenskins clamoring for war. Murmurs of concern spread through the throng, as orcs and goblins began pouring from the pass towards the Dawi. Belegar's brow furrowed with wrath. Why must the gods curse him so? For nearly the last century, Death Pass had been dangerous but passable, even with a sizable force, so long as care was taken. Then he noticed the ragged totems that passed for banners among the greenskins, and felt his ire rise as he recognized the symbol dabbed in dried blood and dung throughout the horde. This rabble had come from Blackcrag, all bearing some variant of a green-skinned face with red fangs. This was troubling news, for although there had been countless orcs in the fallen hold of Karak for some time now, they had not been organized into a single force for as long as Belegar could remember. The timing could not have been worse. With the pass held by so many greenskins, it would be nearly impossible to traverse a safe path to Karak 8 Peaks. Undeterred, the heir of Lun raised his hammer and called for the Dawi to deploy formations immediately. He would die here attempting to cut through all of this Urk filth before he dare return to Everpeak again. Yet as the stubborn dwarves prepared to dig in their heels to face the oncoming horde, a gyrocopter came roaring overhead from the north. Bearing the sigil of the Everpeak Air Corps, the prince couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the interruption as the engineer landed in front of the throng and quickly ran over. He bore a missive from the High King himself, who demanded that Belegar immediately cease his march and return to the capital. Scowling, Ironhammer was tempted to crumple the message and charge into battle, but noted that Thorgrim mentioned there was something the Angren clan would need if their quest was to have any hope of success. Swearing a prolific series of curses, Prince Belegar dismissed the messenger and turned to order his throng into a full retreat. Chased into the dimming light by the taunting cries of the greenskins, the Dawi fell back with naught but their pride wounded. So failed the third expedition to Karak 8 Peaks. Belegar trembled with barely contained rage as he marched towards the king's hall in Karaz Ankor. Thorgrim may be his king, but the swift order to abandon the march towards Vala Azrangul had been at the very least insulting. The prince feared that perhaps the High King had at last been convinced by his advisors to stand against Belegar's dream to recapture his ancestral home. Fortifying his will with Gromril hard resolve, the heir of Lun finally entered the king's hall, preparing to contest his lord's legendarily stubborn nature. He was quickly surprised, however, to see that the High King was not alone. Sitting near Thorgrim Grudgebearer was Belegar's elder cousin, Lord Belegar Hammerfist. Easily his dearest relative and fiercest comrade, Belegar was one of the Everpeak's most gifted generals, and possessed a masterful skill at combat. He had grown to be well respected in the capital after centuries of service, especially famous for his notably calm and collected demeanor, no matter how dire the situation. This has led to some Dawi pondering how things may have been different, as Belegar could have ruled the Karak 8 Peaks clans instead of the infamously hot-blooded Belegar, if one of his ancestors had not been passed over due to having no male heirs. Regardless, the Lord of the Akron clan's loyalty to Ironhammer was unquestionable, and all knew he would gladly sacrifice his life to see Belegar's dreams of retaking the 8 Peaks be fulfilled. Also sat around the ornate table filled with sizzling meats and only the highest quality dwarf beer were numerous other lords representing the greatest clans of Karaz Ankor. Intermixed were even the leaders of the various organizations within the hold, most notably the Engineers Guild and the Slayer Cult. Finally, sat to the High King's other flank was none other than the legendary Thoric Ironbrow, Master Runelord of Karak Azul. The heir of Lun struggled not to appear nervous as all eyes in the room turned to focus upon him. A few moments passed before the High King finally leaned forward upon the throne of power, his ice blue eyes piercing Belegar's very soul. The prince listened carefully as Thorgrim finally revealed what he had been doing since Belegar's first expedition to Karak 8 Peaks. When Ironhammer had returned successfully from his quest with priceless artifacts in hand, the High King knew that the time had come to enact his most ambitious plan. Thorgrim had begun quietly rallying support for Belegar's cause, drumming up a burning passion across the Karaz Ankor, while seeking out those who would aid in striking out the most heinous grudge in the Damaz Kron. To this end, he also sent word of the lost relics recovered to Thorgrim Ironbrow, who had immediately journeyed north to see for himself. Thorgrim's deep passion for rediscovering the lost runic lore of his people was well known to Thorgrim, and upon witnessing what Belegar had retrieved with such a small expedition, the Rune Lord immediately committed his aid to the cause. The heir of Lund struggled not to smile as the words passed over him. After the High King concluded his tale, Lord Dudergar was the first to stand and pledge his hammer to Belegar's cause. Slowly, each lord around the table followed suit until it swung back around to the ornery Rune Lord. Thorgrim didn't bother rising from his seat, but bluntly informed the prince that he would pledge an entire armory of runic axes and hammers forged by Ironbrow himself from Karak Azul's legendary iron forges. Belegar nodded his graciousness to each promise made, his pride and ambition relit into that roaring inferno he had felt in his youth. Without any further delays, the prince took his seat at the table, and the king's hall became filled with the sound of strategy and planning. Years flew by in the blink of an eye, as Lord Belegar made his preparations alongside his many allies and cousin. While all this time was certainly spent focused on the future of Karak 8 Peaks, not all of it was solely on matters of war. Now publicly supported by the High King, the Angren clan swiftly found itself drowning in propositions from the other families of Everpeak. Amid these countless exchanges, one issue rose to the surface as the most important in virtually every Dawi's opinion. Belegar needed a wife. The prince found himself being rushed from meeting to meeting without end, either planning out his assault on Vala Azrael Ungol with Dudergar, or listening to marriage arrangements suggested by his clan's elders. Although in dwarf culture it's not unheard of for a Dawi to select his bride based on beauty or compatibility, most sensible mountain folk tend to instead focus on the size of their dowry. Belegar was certainly one such dwarf, so when all the most affluent clans had made their offers, he almost too swiftly selected the clan which gave him the largest sum of gold and warriors. This wasn't terribly cold, however, as the only real reason each clan offered up their daughters was to essentially call claims on Belegar's heir, who would become the next king of the certain-to-be-reclaimed Karak 8 Peaks. Whether through the mercy of the ancestor gods or simply good luck, Belegar's choice paired him with a Wren named Kema. Possessing a beauty and radiance only contested by the glistening peaks of Vala Azrael Ungol herself, the first time Belegar laid eyes upon Kema, his breathing stopped. Being from one of Karaz Ankor's royal clans, High King Thorgrim was quite pleased with the heir of Lund's selection, and it was well known Grudgebearer doted favorably upon her. Although the marriage was certainly a political arrangement, thankfully Kema herself quickly fell for the regal prince of the Angren clan, and love blossomed between the two. The entirety of the Everpeak turned out for the ceremony, and for the first time in many years, an untainted feeling of hope and joy rang through the capital. The final months passed as preparations finalized for the fourth expedition of Belegar's quest to Karak 8 Peaks. Now happily married, much to the surprise of as many gossipers believed no Wren could contest his heart for that of Vala Azrael Ungol, the prince received one final request to appear before Thorgrim Grudgebearer. The heir of Lund entered to find the High King alone upon the throne of power, tutting to himself as he carefully flipped through the pages of the Great Book of Grudges. Ironhammer, not being the most patient of Dawi, audibly cleared his throat, which clearly interrupted Thorgrim's moment based on the glare that flicked up from the Damas Kron. After a minute of letting stern disapproval hang in the air, the High King's eyes returned to the pages of the Great Book of Grudges and he spoke. In less than a week's time, the fourth expedition to Vala Azrael Ungol would march forth from Karaz Ankor. Regardless of whether it found success or failure, this would undoubtedly be the final one. Thorgrim noted that although he had many brave warriors, the best equipment available, and clearly the most determined will to see this task done, that alone would not be enough. Beyond the promised assistance of his own throngs, ancestral runic weapons, and his own axe, Thorgrim had one final thing that Belegar would need if he were to be successful. Karak 8 Peaks could not be reclaimed by any Lord of the Dawi. Only her true king would have any hope to succeed. So, to that affair, before the sun set behind the western peaks, Belegar would be prince no longer. The heir of Lun responded properly for a true dwarf, bowing his head in respect as he felt the cold weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. To be a king of the Dawi came with a heavy burden, for the legacy of the dwarfs would rest in his hands. Knowing what was to come, Belegar left the king's hall as a prince for the final time, to prepare properly for the ceremony that would take place that evening. As the sun sank behind the Black Mountains, the heir of Lun knelt before the High King of Karaz Ankor in the middle of a colossal hall. Representatives from holds far as the Mountains of Morn in the east to cold Norska in the north had come to bear witness. Thousands of Dawi looked on as Thorgrim Grudgebearer's voice boomed out across the hall, reading out all the entries in the Damazkron detailing the fall of Karak 8 Peaks. Tears flowed freely down the faces of even the most stalwart Longbeards as the reading continued for hours, every dwarf silently mouthing the words, as each knew the hallowed grudges by heart. Belegar remained kneeling the entire time, the hammer of Angren resting upon the floor before him, and his fists tightening around its haft with each wrong against his ancestors that was recited. The slaughter of the Firehelm clan, the destruction of the Karak Zilfin mines, the warpstone poisoning of the wells, the fall of the upper citadel, the murder of Thane Halkenhoff Stonebeard, the citadel's gatekeeper, the cowardly Thagaraki using poison gas to kill innocents, the tremors that caused lava to belch up from massive wounds in the earth, the fall of each of the 8 peaks, one by one, the abandonment of Vala Azrael, and all those who have died seeking to reclaim it. Finally, the grudges of Karak 8 Peaks concluded as the High King reverently closed the Damazkron. The only sound in the densely packed hall was that of soft sighs and beards dabbing away tear streaks. Thorgrim turned to one of his throne bearers, reaching out to take another tome that also bore great size and age. Carefully, he opened Clan Angren's Book of Lineage, which carefully detailed their bloodline all the way back to the ancestor gods themselves. Starting with the divine Grugni and Valea, the High King read every entry until after another few hours, he read out the name of Belegar, son of Katagar. The heir of Lun raised his gaze to meet Thorgrim's as the king began to read the oaths of kingship. Every few minutes, the High King would pause and look up, waiting for Belegar to swear a completed oath before nodding and beginning the next. With the duties, holdings, and land carefully outlined as the Lord of Vala Azrael, the High King fell silent. At long last, Thorgrim told Ironhammer to rise as the true king of Karak 8 Peaks. The time had finally come to launch one final assault on the ancestral hold of the Angren clan. No mere expedition marched from Karaz Ankor this time, but 2 large throngs, fully prepared for war. High King Thorgrim led the dwarfs of the Everpeak upon his throne of power, already muttering to himself as he flipped through the Damazkron and its pages relevant to Karak 8 Peaks. Beside him strode King Belegar Ironhammer, who proudly commanded a force of roughly 300 of the best warriors he had available from a myriad of clans. Each warrior was outfitted like a hero of old, covered in flawlessly crafted heavy armor and wielding runic weapons that crackled with barely contained power. The thanes and lords among the Grim Brotherhood stood out even further, as each had been entrusted with a runic ancient artifact from the deepest vaults of Karaz Ankor itself. Not since the Great War against Chaos had such a throng been mustered within the Karaz Ankor. Behind the host of clans dwarfs ready for battle came a baggage train of merchants, families, and craftsmen ready to populate the halls of Karak 8 Peaks. Excluding the Dawi who marched with the High King, roughly 500 brave souls had committed to the dangerous journey, with a cautious hope brimming in their hearts. The first trial appeared quickly, as King Belegar led his host past the ruins of an old outpost fortress along the road leading into Uzkul Kadrin. As the sun dipped behind the rumbling black clouds heavy with water, rangers returned from ahead to report that the outpost, called Karak was infested with Groby. Rain began to pour ominously as dusk shifted swiftly to night, and shrill cries began to come from the dilapidated fort. Ironhammer grunted with annoyance as hundreds of small pointed hoods appeared along the battlements. Signaling for the throngs to prepare for siege formations with a wave of his hammer, Belegar walked over to meet with the other lords who gathered around Thorgrim's throne. Hundreds of black-fletched arrows were fired by the greenskins guarding Karak, but the Dawi didn't so much as acknowledge the volleys, for each of them landed comically short due to the weather. As King Belegar discussed strategy with his generals Lord Duergar and the High King, things quickly became heated despite the torrential downpour. Thorgrim wanted to patiently set up for a long siege, for once the war machines were fully deployed, it would be slow but simple work to take the keep. Ironhammer balked at the suggestion. He had taken this route what felt like countless times, and he knew that every second was precious. The more time wasted on the path to 8 Peaks, the more difficult it would be to recapture. Thus, he bluntly interrupted the ongoing discussions on how best to implement the siege, informing Grudgebearer that he would personally crack the gate of Karak and take the fortress. A stunned silence met the king of Vala Azrael Ungol's statement, for not only had he rudely inserted himself during Duergar's own speech, but his plan flew in the face of good dwarfen sense. Before anyone could rally from their surprise, Belegar was already roaring for his rangers and miners to join him and heading towards the gate. Thorgrim scowled, and his deep voice carried after Ironhammer. This plan was folly. Those gates were properly dwarf-made, and to shatter them would not only be an insult to the ancestors that built them, but would be impossible for any dwarf that didn't desire to be made into a goblin pincushion. Despite this direct order to cease from his High King, Belegar didn't even so much as acknowledge the concerns, and charged off with a Khazalid war cry on his lips. The last thing he heard coming from Thorgrim as he ran towards Karak was the High King reading aloud as he wrote a grudge against King Belegar of Karak 8 Peaks for outright insubordination. Instead of shame, Ironhammer couldn't help himself but feel his pride surge at hearing his kingship mentioned. As he joined those Dawi who loyally followed him towards the gate, a colossal roar tore through the pass. A loud wah! Turning his head in surprise as he continued to jog through the downpour, Belegar swore as he saw an endless tide of orcs come pouring out from small side roads along Death Pass. As the many streams of greenskins united into a massive horde, it bore down on Thorgrim's throng, who expertly had already turned to face this new threat. Ironhammer's eyes narrowed as he saw countless banners and symbols denoting foul orc faces with red fangs, the same massive tribe that had prevented the third expedition. Shaking his head to focus, the king spurred his own warriors forward as he raised his shield to block another hail of poorly aimed goblin arrows. There was only one course now. If he could get the gates of Karak open, then the Dawi would easily be able to clear out the fallen fortress, and it would allow a perfect position to deal with this orc ambush. The night goblins in Karak continued unleashing volley after volley of poisoned arrows, and the occasional lobbed boulder, but none of the dwarfs behind Belegar so much as suffered a scratch thanks to their heavy armor and questionable Groby accuracy. Thankfully, the orcs had also launched their ambush prematurely, and the main Dawi throng was far out of range for the goblins. Ironhammer finally sprinted the final distance to the large gate, typically dwarven tenacity, ensuring the sucking mud barely fazed him despite wearing a full set of Gromril armor. He looked up at the mighty Wuthroth doors before him, which had been crudely reinforced with repulsive Groby alterations over the millennia of their infestation. Belegar scowled as his mind raced, trying to search for some weak point, muttering a truly impressive series of profanity before turning at the sound of his own retinue approaching. Quickly, the king gathered the sage council of his most experienced miners, nodding carefully as they frantically explained the possible options available. Despite the collected centuries of experience from sapping work and sieges, none of the prospectors had any solutions that would grant immediate access into Karak. As he aggressively pressed for ways to crack the gate, a messenger stumbled out of the downpour to deliver a command from the High King. He demanded that Belegar return with his troops to support Lord Duergar's forces on the right flank. Already, Ironhammer's name had been entered into the Damaskran a second time in grudgment for those Dawi who were dying thanks to his absence. Instead, the king of Karak 8 Peaks angrily dismissed the messenger, claiming that he would destroy the gate shortly. Grumbling, the messenger ran back out towards Thorgrim's throng, where the sound of brutal violence continued. Desperation began to take hold of Belegar's mind, so soon into their expedition and things were already dire. His teeth grated as shame radiated through his body just thinking about the embarrassment of the second and third attempts to take Karak 8 Peaks. The unbearable indignity of his ancestral home being full of foul greenskins and disgusting skaven for over 2,000 years. The heir of Lund could not bear it any longer. He felt his anger surge like an inferno, infusing his limbs with a might that could only be described as the wrath of all his disgraced ancestors. He would have vengeance. With a roar of Kazook, Belegar leapt forwards with the hammer of Angrund and swung with all his might. Blow after blow rained upon the disfigured gate, the cowardly night goblins behind cackling at the impotent attack. But that laughter quickly turned to silence, as one of the hammer's strikes caused a thunderous boom, cracking the ancient Wuthroth. The next hit exploded one of the shoddy goblin patch jobs on a gaping hole. Another, blowing open entirely through the gate, and the support beam behind it. Belegar's hammer could only be described as a blur, the stunned Grim Brotherhood only able to watch with awe as their king tore the doors apart in an absurd display of raw determination. With one final cry, Ironhammer took up his clan's heirloom with both hands and brought it down like a meteor against the center of the gate. A splintering peal of wooden thunder rang out as the doors exploded inward. The way into Karak was open. Belegar afforded himself a single bark of laughter before he charged forwards, cleaving into the shocked Groby standing within. Roaring cries to Grimnir, the Grim Brotherhood followed their king even as a ranger sprinted to inform the lords fighting against the Urk. High King Thorgrim's throng began a careful retreat towards Karak when word arrived, falling back slowly as a unified shield wall. Belegar's forces swiftly took the walls to clear the way, as the main throng's artillery and ranged forces ran into the keep and deployed along the battlements, opening fire into the pursuing orcs. With the protection of the walls preventing a meaningful surround, the greenskins were forced to bottleneck towards Karak as they crashed against the shields of Ironbreakers and Longbeards. The battle was a massacre. The the dwarfs able to utilize every advantage until the massive orc warboss realized he had lost and begrudgingly fell back. The first major step on the road to Vala Azrael had been taken with the recapture of Karak. The fortress finally returned into dwarf hands after millennia of greenskin occupation. An important victory, though many brave Dawi had fallen due to the unusually shrewd tactics utilized by the orc warboss, who had led the ambushing horde. Not to mention, the massive Urk had killed scores of clansdwarfs on its own, with the colossal red-glowing scimitar it had wielded to deadly effect. Although the brute had escaped retribution, a large hunting squad of rangers had been sent after him. Belegar sincerely hoped that this is the last he would hear of Gorfang Rotgut. After shoring up the defenses of the retaken fortress and leaving a small garrison force behind, the two throngs continued their march through Uzkul Kadrin. With warboss Gorfang defeated and off licking his wounds for the moment, the Dawi made swift progress with no organized resistance from local tribes or Rotgut's Red Fangs out of Blackcrag. It wasn't long before they had claimed a handful of other outposts along the road and emerged from the pass. Waiting on the wasteland beyond was another dwarf throng, this one from Karak and led by the rune lord Thorgrim Ironbrow. A brief meeting took place between the lords of all three armies to exchange news and information pertinent to the objective. The first phase of the fourth expedition had now been complete. The road connecting Karaz Ankor to Karak 8 Peaks was clear enough to allow passage and trade. Clearly, the Urk of Blackcrag would continue to be a threat, but at least there would be a handful of reclaimed outposts to allow for a dwarf presence. Thorgrim had fulfilled his oaths to assist Belegar by getting him this far, and the two kings parted on friendly terms. Ironhammer often found the High King insufferable, but deep down greatly respected his lord. With that, the throng of Karaz Ankor marched back north to return home, and prepare to further secure the outpost recently recaptured. King Belegar was left alone with the ornery rune lord, quickly finding himself wishing his cousin Lord Duergar had stayed instead of returning to the capital. As Ironhammer endured the berating that passed for conversation with a living ancestor like Ironbrow, the combined throngs of the Grim Brotherhood and Karak made their way south. With Death Pass drifting over the horizon, the Dawi could already spy the beauteous 8 peaks rising in the distance. Belegar's eyes misted with anticipation as each of the mountains came into view, whispering their names reverently like a prayer, as did every dwarf so blessed to see them. Karagnar, the Sunrise Mountain. Karaglun, the Crescent Mountain. Karakrin, the Redstone Mountain. Karagyar, the Sunset Mountain. Karagmornar, the Shadow Mountain. Karakzilfin, the Windswept Mountain. Karagril, the Silverhorn Mountain. And Kivinwir, the White Lady, the most beautiful of the peaks and the last to fall in Vala Azrael's dark past. Belegar noted that even Thorek fell into a reverent silence at the sight of Karak 8 Peaks, the weight of their quest clearly being felt by every Dawi present. Looking over his people, Ironhammer's gaze rested on his wife Kemma for a long moment before his attention was drawn to some rangers swiftly approaching the throng. Although made up mostly of scouts from Karak, they were led by Faragrim of the Angren clan. King Belegar summoned his lords to gather, knowing the time had come to make their final preparations to capture Vala Azrael. As he stood beside Thorgrim Ironbrow awaiting Faragrim's report, the heir of Lund couldn't help but grimace as he thought about the failed second expedition. This time would be different. It had to be. Much to everyone's surprise, however, the Rangers arrived bearing bizarrely good news. The citadel, along with all of the surface city, was vulnerable, more so than it had ever been. Thorgrim spoke of how a colossal battle had been fought between the Skaven and Night Goblins, due to some new Groby warlord. And while both sides had suffered tremendous casualties, the Ratmen had been completely decimated for now. Belegar resisted the urge to smile at the news. Clearly, the ancestor gods favored their expedition. With the Thagaraki out of the equation, it would be infinitely easier to establish a foothold. Furthermore, the excavator continued, during his time scouting out the hold, he had discovered a secret path along the slopes of Karak, the northern peak. The heir of Lund could hardly believe it. One of his oldest allies from the first expedition, Grunfin Goldfinder, had noted such a hidden pass on one of his legendary maps, but the Grim Brotherhood had never been able to find it. It also spoke of runic doors cleverly disguised, which if used could allow a small band of Dawi to sneak behind enemy lines into the citadel itself. A plan lit up in Belegar's mind, as all the pieces fell perfectly into place. Without pausing to explain, he ordered for the dwarves to make haste for the northern pass that winded over Karak. They would camp there for the night, and come morning, the Dawi would finally have their reckoning. Belegar's strategy went off without a hitch, and the battle for Karak 8 Peaks took place that following day as the sun rose over Karak Nar. That tale will be covered in detail during the famous battle section. For now, suffice to say that after a brutal conflict, the dwarfs were victorious and captured the citadel. After 29 generations, the Angrand clan had reclaimed their ancestral home. King Belegar had succeeded. After the Greenskin assault was pushed back, Ironhammer quickly led his best warriors on a series of lightning raids to reclaim artifacts from the first deep hold, as the remaining Dawi reinforced the citadel above. The Grim Brotherhood successfully purged the surface city, immediately making repairs and reinforcing the outer walls protecting the Vale. All but one of the tunnels leading into the first deep are sealed with blasting charges, and mighty doors with runic wards crafted by Thoric Ironbrow himself. With the surface city cleared of greenskin filth, Belegar knew the throng of Karak Azul had to return home. Nodding his thanks to Thoric, the two lords parted on good terms, with Ironbrow swearing one day he would return to assist reclaiming more hidden treasures from the darkest depths of Vala Azrael Ungol. With his brave wife Kemma at his side, Ironhammer took his official place as the true king of Karak 8 Peaks at long last. As his engineers and runesmiths oversaw the repair of the walls circling the citadel, Belegar personally led his Ironbreakers on numerous bloody ventures into the First Deep. Slowly, but surely, they began to clear it of Groby and discovered evidence that the Skaven had returned in force. The king was displeased to find the Thagaraki's presence, but hoped that perhaps his two ancestral enemies would be more focused on each other than him. At first, things were going well. The First Deep suddenly made clear of goblins after a few crushing defeats, causing the cowardly creatures to flee. The heir of Lund quickly capitalized on this progress, and opened the sealed pathways to the First Deep from the citadel, while patrols were sent to begin scouting out the Second Deep. As efforts were made by Craftsdawi to clean and reinforce the First Deep, reports began to trickle in about the occasional dwarf vanishing in the night. Even the Ironbreaker patrols were not immune, with pairs of the heavily armored warriors suddenly not returning to their posts with no trace. Concerned, King Belegar ordered for all patrols to double in size, and did his best to comfort those families whose loved ones had vanished. Shrewd as he was stubborn, Ironhammer carefully investigated the reports himself, and discovered signs that all pointed at backstabbing Groby. As funerals were commenced, he returned to the citadel frustrated that nothing could be done to find the bodies of those taken. After weeks of silence, a panicked messenger came running into the audience chamber, which now functioned as a throne room, with terrible news. night goblins had attacked a large patrol at the entrance to the Second Deep, and the kidnapped Dawi had been found. When Belegar finally arrived alongside the Iron Brotherhood, his personal bodyguard of hammerers, a horrifying scene awaited him. He found many brave Dawi slain, clear evidence that at least a score of them had been crushed by trolls based on their remains. Speaking with the survivors for a debriefing on what had occurred, he was alarmed to find his old ally, the runesmith Braknar, smoldering in a black rage. From the son of Brengar, he learned that the Groby had used the captured prisoners from the past weeks as bait to lure out the dwarves. Each of them had been dragged out into view, clearly having been mutilated by torture but still alive. The night goblins had then began torturing them further, before messily butchering the crippled captives with their own weapons and urinating on the corpses. At this, Belegar's grip around the hammer of Angrun became tight enough to turn coal into diamond as he broiled with anger. It was little wonder that the warriors had charged out from their post and then been ambushed by the greenskins from all sides. The cunning of it disturbed Belegar greatly. Cruel as they may be, goblins weren't known for being gifted tacticians. Ironhammer had his attention drawn back to Braknar, who claimed he had seen the creature leading the Groby. A skulking night goblin who had been giving orders like some kind of Ungi general that had a colossal cave beast beside him. The scheming coward had stolen his rune staff before the dwarves had retreated and closed the door to the Second Deep. Belegar rested a comforting hand upon his old ally's shoulder before turning back to the Dawi, awaiting orders, immediately having them collect the dead for burial and ensuring the gate to the Second Deep was secured. He also called for 3 regiments of miners and rangers to scout the Second Deep and report on how bad things were. Of those, only 1 returned, bringing word that it was now flooded with goblins and skaven, clearly the prior emptiness of the deep having been a ruse. Scowling, Belegar thought about the war boss Braknar had described, and swore he would smite the beast to avenge all those slain. He ordered the tunnel be completely shut, and only opened for brief moments to allow those permitted to explore the lower depths, until they had enough reinforcements to properly engage the filth below. Many names were entered into the Karak 8 Peaks Book of Grudges this day, for all those missing and slain. Yet this was only the beginning of the creature who would come to be Belegar's most hated foe. Over the following months, things grew worse, as most nights the surface city and First Deep echoed with the sound of captured Dawi being tortured somewhere hidden. Poles began to be erected outside the city's walls, with bloody beards and scalps hanging in the wind. Any attempt to remove these were met with overwhelming force, often resulting in those who went out joining the macabre trophies upon the poles. Finally having enough, Belegar personally struck out to devastating effect against these totems, and scoured them from the earth, along with hundreds of overeager Groby, squigs, and trolls who had hoped to ambush him. With these repulsive traps destroyed, the mysterious war boss bafflingly sent his first message to the Dawi. A beardling, only 60 winters, was brought before the king. His eyes, hands, feet, tongue, and beard had all been removed with crude knives, though he still lived. Grundar Thronkinson was his name, though upon his back was carved a different one in crude Khazalid. Skarsnik. Belegar's wrath was mighty, as he instantly knew who was responsible for all the suffering his people had endured in their first year. He forbade anyone from speaking the name Skarsnik in his presence, and ensured that all the recent grudges entered into the Kron would demand the war boss's death in recompense. From that moment onward, the king of Karak 8 Peaks carefully observed his foe, who proved to be both cruel and crafty. Paths for those seeking to enter and leave Vala Ancestral Ungol became extremely dangerous, and so only the strongest or luckiest could traverse the roads. Before Belegar could properly develop tactical responses to this, one final request entered the audience chamber. Ironhammer sat beside Kemma with a foreboding frown as runesmith Braknar entered with a small company of dwarfs, who had all lost kith or kin to Skarsnik's cruelty. They humbly petitioned to be allowed to enter the Second Deep, so that they might hunt down the war boss and claim vengeance. Belegar gently noted that while he could not deny them, there would be more appropriate times to seek revenge than now. Queen Kemma swiftly agreed, urging them to lend their steel to protecting those still alive, rather than marching into certain doom. Despite their efforts, the rulers of Karak 8 Peaks could not convince these shamed Dawi to relent their quest. So, the heir of Lund did the only thing he could, and gave them his blessing, with a sincere wish for them to succeed. Braknar and his company would never be seen again. Belegar began to feel despair grip his heart, as it seemed they were outwitted at every turn. Although his pride was much too fierce to ever admit it to his people, or even his beloved wife, the king began to wonder if they were doomed. Every road out of the city was being watched by Groby waiting to ambush, and within each shadow lurked some danger ready to devour isolated Dawi. The Angren clan was trapped, with no respite in sight, and nightmarish tactics used to sap their will performed each night. Stalwart as he was, Ironhammer couldn't fully shake the concern that wore down all his kin. Much as he hated to admit it, they would just have to reinforce the city and the First Deep for now. After nearly 2 long decades of this siege, Belegar found himself approached by a strange band of adventurers who had recently fought their way through goblins into the city. Receiving them in the audience chamber, the king listened carefully as the travelers explained they were men of the Empire who had journeyed to Karak 8 Peaks in search of its lost treasures. Although he found the idea of Umgi recovering dwarf artifacts instead of his kin distasteful, Ironhammer could not refuse such a low-cost effort for his folk to potentially reclaim what rightfully belonged to them. After a fair amount of haggling, the manlings agreed that should they successfully return with any of the lost fortunes of Karak 8 Peaks, they would receive compensation equal to 10% of each treasure. With oaths sworn to secure the arrangement, Belegar ordered for the reinforced gateway into the Second Deep to be opened. Barak Katul, or the Gate to Lurking Danger, finally opened for the first time in years. The Umgi entered without ceremony and descended into the darkness. They never returned. Thus, the door was sealed once more. Barak Katul would open again shortly afterwards, but only for a solitary figure this time. Zaragrim of 8 Peaks, the dwarf who had led Belegar's initial army through the secret pass into the valley during the final expedition, desired to try his own skills of exploration and stealth down below. Although the heir of Lund was hesitant to allow another hero of Vala Ancestral Ungol to descend into her depths, he knew no one else was more skilled. Days passed with no sign of the prospector, but as the exhausted king made his preparations to have the gateway resealed, a stumbling Dawi appeared out of the shadows. Zaragrim had returned, much to everyone's amazement. Belegar struggled to recognize his old companion, as all of his hair had turned ghostly white. While his wounds were tended to by the priestesses of Valea, the Longbeard spoke at length to Ironhammer about what he had witnessed. Beyond the obvious reports of high activity by Skaven, greenskins, and other beasts below, he mentioned a tomb containing a massive amount of treasure. However, it was guarded by a colossal monster, some ancient and terrible creature that claims dominion of the deepest levels. Thorgrim whispered about seeing the spirits of those buried within wandering the dark in a state of unrest, screaming as their souls were tortured by the abomination that now made its lair within their hidden tomb. Deeply disturbed by this news, the king retreated to his throne and ruminated upon what he had learned. He sought the counsel of the high priestess Magda Freyadaughter, the eldest of Valea's chosen acolytes within 8 Peaks. As they spoke at length, however, word arrived that Thorgrim had fled the hold without a word to anyone. Clearly, whatever monster the prospector had discovered was so terrifying that he could remain no longer. Ironhammer ordered for Balak Katul to be sealed shut once more until he was ready to act. The Dawi of Karak 8 Peaks were too few as it was, struggling to defend the fragment of the hold they possessed already. Although he deeply desired to march down into the lowest depths and slay the beast himself, it would be nearly impossible to avoid Skarsnik's attention, which could result in a full assault of the upper levels. His kingly vows came first, no matter how it pained him. Strangely enough, it seemed while Thorgrim had abandoned his kin, the prospector had begun to spread the tale of Karak 8 Peaks' lost treasures. Adventurers began to appear at the gates from all over the old world, requesting the opportunity to strike out into the depths in search of fame and fortune. King Ironhammer did his best to warn off such suicidal quests, but most remained steadfast. Thus he allowed them to pass through Balak Katul. Even if they failed to survive, each band would doubtless slay some number of the filth down below, which meant less greenskins and Skaven capable of plaguing the dwarves. However, a tiny percentage of those humans and Dawi that passed through the gate of lurking danger returned. The heir of Lun honored his original promise and paid those who retrieved ancient artifacts or wealth compensation for their efforts. So did a few men find their fortunes despite all odds, but most only found a horrific death awaiting them. Then the most curious band of travelers arrived, seeking to enter the depths of Vala Azrael, a small group of humans, joined by a strange duo of a slayer and some poet from the Empire. While they were brought before Ironhammer, he couldn't help but find them a bizarre pairing, for it was very unusual for a dwarf slayer to select a human to be their rememberer and traveling companion. Regardless, he was honor-bound to allow them through Balak Katul, so that the shamed Dawi might seek his doom. Darkly wishing them luck in the hopeless abyss that awaited, Belegar stood from his throne and left. He turned to see Magda speaking to them, but pressed on to other affairs demanding his attention. There aren't words to properly express the King of Karak 8 Peaks' surprise when the pair returned successfully from the lowest deeps. Although bloodied and the only survivors from their group, the two had succeeded in slaying the massive abomination that Thorgrim had fled from months prior. Belegar struggled to contain his relief as he heard the colorful tale of their quest from the red-cloaked manling. The disturbed ancestors had been laid back to rest, and their tomb resealed by ancient engineering mechanisms so that no Skaven or greenskin filth would disturb them ever again. Satisfied, Ironhammer not only had the two rewarded handsomely, but even allowed the Umgi to keep a magical blade he had discovered without taxation, in recognition of the old oaths of friendship between Sigmar Heldenhammer and the High King Kurgan Ironbeard. As the two left, the heir of Lun couldn't help but feel this would not be the last time he would hear of Gotrek and Felix. With the heroic duo departed, Ironhammer felt a flame of hope reignite in his chest as he surveyed his people. Despite their tenacity and stubborn refusal to show weakness, it was plain for him to see that the Dwarfs of Vala Azrael Ungol were being worn down. If a simple band of wanderers could venture into the dark and emerge victorious despite the odds, why couldn't he? As he brooded upon the throne, his eyes wandered to the spot where so many years ago the beardling Grundar Thronkinson had died. He heard the distant echoes of the last argument he had engaged his friend Braknar in before the runesmith had marched to his doom. With a scowl, he rose to his feet and rose the hammer of Angron to his eyes. It was time. King Belegar would tolerate no more. This psychological warfare had to end now. Gathering his greatest warriors to his side, Ironhammer figured if he was going to strike back at Skarsnik, he would need to be careful. Clearly, the Groby warboss was clever, and had eyes following them from every shadow to track every act. At least, that's what the cowardly creature believed. Without any warning to his kin, the heir of Lund left with a band of warriors through a secret door hidden to all but dwarven eyes that allowed him to enter the Second Deep. Here he went on a quiet mission of brutal vengeance, butchering every collection of oblivious night goblins found lurking within. Before the greenskins could discover the crushed remains of their scouts, the Dawi had already slipped into another hidden door and descended further. The pattern repeated as they scoured each deep of surprised Groby, scores of dead goblins left in their wake. It was in the 8th deep that the king would finally lay eyes upon his hated enemy for the first time. As the lord of the Angron clan descended the last of the stairs into the second vault, the shrill cackling of a Groby came from the darkness ahead. The Iron Brotherhood fanned out beside their king, roughly 20 of Eight Peak's greatest warriors prepared for anything. As tense seconds ticked by, Belegar realized that the Dawi now stood in the tombs of his clan's ancestral dead. From among the shattered sarcophagi emerged a grinning night goblin besides the largest cave beast the dwarf had ever seen. The instant Belegar saw Skarsnik, he launched towards the warlord in an enraged charge. The foul creature would taint his ancestors' burial chambers no longer. As he ran towards his hated rival, a booming roar announced an ambush as tides of goblins interspersed with squigs and trolls rushed into the chamber. Ironhammer wasted hardly a glance on these foes, as he knew they were no match for his kin. He collided alone against the goblin line, his armored weight easily smashing through them and pulverizing any too slow to dodge aside. After a few swift strikes of his rune hammer, nothing but broken Groby and crushed squigs remained around him. Surging forwards, Belegar felt all the frustration and hatred from the last 20 years boil up inside him. The centuries of shame from having such filth occupy Karak 8 Peaks piling on to ignite the wrath of his ancestors with each step. A troll stomped forward and blocked the path to Skarsnik, but even such a brute could not halt revenge incarnate. After decades of trying to remain calm and in control, Belegar finally unleashed his rage upon the beast before him. The hammer of Angron became a blur as it struck lightning fast, crushing bones and pulverizing flesh with each blow. The troll's regeneration struggled to keep up, but gave it enough energy to lean forward and vomit upon the king. Not even Gromril armor can stand against the acidic bile of such monsters, but the shield of defiance deflected the stream to instead rain on the surrounding goblins as runes blazed with power. Belegar swung his ancestral weapon with a roar, and it snapped the beast's head completely sideways with a sickening crack. The dead troll instantly collapsed, and Ironhammer leapt forward, bringing the hammer of Angron hurtling down like a comet towards Skarsnik's shocked face. It was at that moment the heir of Lund discovered just how swift the war boss's massive pet could strike. The cave beast launched towards him with jaws open and brought its razor teeth crunching down in a single eye blink. Belegar raised his shield at the last moment and spared a brief thought for Kemma as darkness consumed him. Instead of being gobbled down, however, the squig's teeth shattered as they impacted the shield of defiance, and it stumbled in agony. The king felt himself spat out before he slammed into a crumbling stone coffin, which knocked the wind from his lungs. Rising to his feet, Belegar quickly turned back to face his foe, only to witness the warlord fleeing into the darkness. He hurled insults after the cowardly Groby, spittle falling into his white beard as he fumed at Skarsnik's escape. As the sound of the bounding cave squig's pained mewling vanished into the depths, the king knew it was over for now. Most of his warriors were wounded from the battle, with one having fallen, but over 100 foul goblins lay dead. They had struck a blow against Skarsnik that the warlord would not soon forget. Gathering their dead, the Iron Brotherhood prepared for the trek back to the citadel, as Belegar scanned the burial chamber he now stood in. One day, he would return and restore this place to its former glory. No matter how long it took, even the deepest vault would be reclaimed by Dawi. He looked down and pondered upon a large chunk of rune-struck rock that laid before him. Reaching down to heft the stone over his shoulder, the lord of the Angren clan could think of nothing more suitable to serve as his oath stone than a piece of his ancestor's tomb. A promise made of eternal stone that he would stand upon and take not one step back. With his prize in hand, the Iron Brotherhood returned to the citadel, and as the engravers fashioned the boulder into a proper oath stone, the tale of his venture spread. Despite the disapproval caused by his sudden disappearance, none could contest that the Dawi of Vala Azrael were inspired once more. From that point onward, Belegar began to claim the upper hand in the battle for Karak 8 Peaks. Despite the ruthless cunning of Skarsnik, the Night Goblins of the Crooked Moon tribe weren't nearly as dangerous without his direct guidance. Every Dawi, on the other hand, was now a skilled veteran of over 20 years of underground ambush warfare, with an az to grind. Groby tunnels were collapsed by expertly placed charges. Hidden doors would suddenly unleash a band of roaring dwarves into the midst of sleeping greenskins, and clever death traps were engineered in narrow halls to wipe out entire regiments. After 3 years of finally acquiring some semblance of respite, the survivors of the Angren clan felt secure. The king knew it wouldn't last, however. Sooner or later, that foul goblin would rig the game back in its favor. That was when the orcs began to appear. At first, they only appeared in small groups, maybe 10 or 20 belligerent greenskins easily dealt with by a squad of rangers. Then the Urk began arriving in regiments of 50 or more. War camps were set up outside of the walls, eventually settling outside of cannon range after the first few were blown to pieces. The tribes seemed random in the beginning, bearing all sorts of crude designs to mark their allegiance. Ironhammer sent out scouts hoping to learn how many more would come, noting that the camps continued to swell with more greenskins each passing day. When the rangers returned, they bore disturbing news that this was hardly even the vanguard of the oncoming horde. Hundreds were marching through Death Pass even now, all originating from the fallen hold of Black Crag. Bearing the mark of a red fang on all their banners, it was clear that the tyrant of Kalakdraz had decided to join up with Skarsnik. Gorefang Rotgut, the Squatter King. Only the gods alone knew how many orcs served that monster, but Belegar knew he had only about 300 souls with which to defend the East Gate. as the Red Fang tribe began to slowly surround the entirety of Karak 8 Peak's outer walls, the heir of Lun made his preparations for a long siege. Months rolled by, and as the nights became longer, the number of orcs and goblins around Karak 8 Peaks crossed well over 10,000 strong. Although it was plain for all eyes to see, Belegar's pride would not let him admit they were doomed. He continued to plan and strategize with his lords, carefully rationing their remaining supplies and ensuring any probing attacks on the gates were violently repelled. Every dead greenskin, though, meant nothing to the numberless horde, while each dwarf casualty was sorely felt. Many of the Thanes suggested that aid be requested from Karak Azul or Everpeak, but Ironhammer was loath to call upon those he already owed great debts to. He refused each such petition with angered rants, but finally relented when his beloved wife pressed the subject. Kemma did not fear her husband's wrath, and her stubbornness nearly outstripped his own. Relenting at last, Belegar ordered a missive be sent to Lord Duergar in Karaz Ankor immediately. A small band of rangers took a hidden tunnel that led out into the western slopes, where the greenskin horde was at its thinnest. All the king could do was pray to Grugni for their success and safety. The remainder of the year came and went with minor affair, for thankfully, while the greenskins massively outnumbered the Dawi, the walls proved an effective deterrent. The constant infighting among the starving orcs also helped significantly, since no war boss had managed to bully the horde into an organized force. Skarsnik and Gorfang were mysteriously absent, at least for now. Things quickly exploded into action, though, in the late spring, when a messenger came sprinting into the audience chamber with all the speed he possessed. He approached the throne, shouting that a mighty throng of Dawi, bearing the banners of the Akron clan, Lord Duergar's kin, had been sighted, but they were walking right into a trap, as the greenskin horde were preparing to encircle them. The heir of Lun jumped up immediately, while roaring for his throng to assemble at the citadel's entrance. The Dawi of Karak 8 Peak spurred to action with seasoned practice, 200 warriors gathering in mere minutes, fully prepared for battle. Belegar's mind raced as he looked out towards the east and saw his cousin's army quickly being surrounded by an endless tide of greenskins. He needed to act fast if there was to be any hope. His eyes settled on the east gate for a moment, and he knew what he had to do. Calling for his engineers to bring all the kegs of black powder they could carry, he led the throng stealthily down towards the gate. Night Goblin scouts stood around the wall, likely to keep an eye out for Belegar's intervention, but the Groby were far too focused cackling at the battle to notice their doom approaching. After butchering the greenskins, Ironhammer and his troops gathered in the shadow of the east gate as the sounds of battle reached them. The heir of Lun rested his hand upon the wall and closed his eyes in a silent prayer. There was no question that what he was about to do would be considered sacrilege by most Dawi, but Karak 8 Peaks could not afford to let so many brave warriors die. The engineers arrived moments later, and Belegar stiffly ordered them to deploy all the powder kegs here. They were going to use the ancient stone itself as a weapon. After a shocked silence, he turned and gave them a look that would brook no argument, and the charges were set. The throng of Karak 8 Peaks quickly entered formation, and without delay, the king raised the Hammer of Angrund in signal. After a few tense seconds, the earth shook as a colossal explosion shattered a portion of the venerable eastern wall into soaring boulders. Thanks to the flawless work of the dwarf engineers, the blast hardly shook Belegar's warriors, and the chunks of masonry came crashing down exclusively upon the heads of Urk. Taking advantage of the greenskins' confusion as they reeled from the detonation, the king charged out of the gap and slammed into his foes. Spearheading the assault, he killed scores before the Groby even noticed they were under attack from behind. Hundreds fell before the Dawi of Vala Azraelungol, as Duergar's own throng began to fight its way towards them. For once, it wasn't hard for Belegar to spy Skarsnik on the battlefield, seeing the wretched warboss shrieking orders from a vantage point further up the valley. Despite all their infamous toughness, the orcs caught between the Angrund and Akrund dwarves found themselves brutally cut down. The Dawi began to sing one of their ancestral dirges as the two throngs met on the battlefield, seamlessly combining into a single massive square formation, with shields facing every direction. Now over 2,000 dwarfs strong, the army began fighting its way back towards the east gate. Before Belegar could breathe easy, however, he saw a blast of green lightning from Skarsnik's bizarre weapon signal some desperate final assault. The night goblins retreated from the orcs of Blackcrag, and a great commotion went up behind them. The heir of Lund couldn't help but groan when an entire legion of squigs suddenly burst out of cages and came bounding towards them, along with a series of particularly massive cave beasts chained together into whirling balls of certain death. Even an entire shield wall of Gromril-clad ironbreakers would be annihilated by such an attack. But as the tornado of snapping jaws tore through the unfortunate orcs before it, Belegar heard his cousin cry out an order. Unnoticed by Ironhammer until now, many slayers tore forward from the formation and slammed into the squigs in a whirlwind of axes and hammers. Although many of the cult of Grimnir met their doom, the bounding balls of red flesh were completely wiped out, and the throng successfully cleared the wall. Joined by the surviving slayers, Belegar's army fell back to the citadel as the greenskins tried pouring in through the gap in pursuit. The king of Karak 8 Peaks was afforded a rare smile, as his preparations for such an event were unleashed. Without warning, numerous war machines hidden with runes of concealment along with prepared regiments of quarrelers and thunderers opened fire on the densely packed Groby. It was a massacre, cannonballs tearing through scores of Urk and flame cannons incinerating pockets of squealing goblins. As the doors to the citadel slammed shut, the Dawi knew that they had won. As the defensive batteries dealt with any overeager greenskins seeking to pursue the dwarves into the city itself, Belegar finally had a moment to embrace his cousin. Lord Duergar Hammerfist was well met, resplendent in his war attire, and still strong despite being the older of the two. Ironhammer quickly led Duergar and his generals to the audience chamber, where they set about filling him in on their venture from Everpeak. The king found his mood soured a fair bit when he learned the Battle of the East Gate was not the first hurdle the clan Akrund dwarves had faced on the road. Somehow, the Urk had been alerted to their movements, and they had been ambushed by a massive horde led by none other than Gorfang Rotgut himself. Surrounded and outnumbered, many heroic Dawi met their end in Mad Dog Pass during what would come to be known as the Battle of the Jaws. Despite Rotgut's cleverness, however, the Warboss's Wolfrider scouts had given away his ambush too early, so when his armies sprung up from the tunnels that riddled the walls of Varakadran, they found the dwarves prepared for battle. The fighting had been fierce, but Duergar managed to seize victory when in a bold charge along with 30 clan warriors, he engaged Gorfang in a duel. Despite the Squatter King's colossal size and strength, Lord Hammerfist managed to ruin one of the brute's eyes with a perfectly timed strike. Half blind and in agony, the Urk fled, and with his defeat, the horde scattered into the valley. From there, the throng had marched unopposed until Skarsnik's own ambush. An unfortunate number had been murdered along the road, and all of their names were entered into the Book of Grudges. But nonetheless, the Dawi of Karak 8 Peaks had something to celebrate. Against all odds, they had survived, and were now stronger than ever. With his forces now swelled to a massive size thanks to Karaz Ankor's reinforcements, Belegar was able to claim massive amounts of new territory. In less than a month, the Dawi roughly patched the eastern wall, and purged the entire surface city of Groby. In addition, Ironhammer managed to reclaim the clan halls in the Second Deep, the King's Chambers in the Third Deep, the Great Hall in the Fourth Deep, and the Foundries in the Fifth Deep. With these locations secure, Karak 8 Peaks slowly ebbed to life as a functioning hold once more, instead of merely a glorified outpost. To honor the occasion, King Belegar hosted a celebration in the Great Hall, where the Grimnir Miners Chorus and Baldrickson Brewers provided entertainment. For the first time in over 3,000 years, the fall of the Southern Holds does resonate about the 8 Peaks once more. A few months later, further reinforcements arrive, as clans whose ancestors fled from Karak 8 Peaks in ages past returned home after millennia. Gathered from Karaz Ankor, Karak Azul, and the Dawi from the Empire of Men, they are received merrily by Belegar. In recognition of their arrival, he strikes out grudges against the Dourback, Craghand, Guthric, Ironfinger, and Flintheart clans. The heir of Lund declaring that their bolstering of the whole now is fair recompense for the early transgressions of their ancestors by abandoning Vala Azrael Ungol. The large number of dwarfs now residing within Vala Azrael Ungol allowed Belegar to quickly set multiple tasks into motion simultaneously. For the many craftsmen that had arrived, the king charged them with repairing the eastern wall. So long as the necessary wound caused during the Battle of the East Gate remained, the surface city would never be fully secure. Many warriors would be required to guard the project, as the stonemasons, engineers, and artisans worked their craft. Outside of that major project, several specialty missions were also assigned, such as the Engineers Guild constructing a gyrocopter landing pad on the high steeps of Karak Lun, goat herders and farmers from the Brewers Guild securing hidden pastures among the peaks, and the Miners Guild sending out stealthy expeditions to hopefully discover new veins of precious silver. The most important mission set upon, however, was Belegar's quest to reopen the Undgren beneath Karak 8 Peaks. Long ago, the Underway allowed safe passage both to Karak Draz and Karak Azul, before catastrophic earthquakes heralding the time of woe had struck. During one of his delvings, Belegar discovered the path south to the Ironhold was in surprisingly good condition. It wouldn't take much work to restore the Underway and resume safe trade between Karak Azul and Vala Azrael Ungol. Thus, the heir of Lund personally led small bands of Ironbreakers into the depths whenever possible, to clear out the nests of Skaven and Greenskins within. Gyrocopter messengers immediately set off for Karak Azul, bearing word of Ironhammer's objective, and King Cazador quickly set his own crews to work from his side. It took around 15 years for the long underground road to be cleared of debris and enemies between the two holds. When the route was at last cleared, King Belegar invited the Dawi of the Southern Hold to join him in celebration at the urging of Queen Kemma. For the first time in living memory, hundreds of dwarves, both civilian and military, traveled in blessed safety to Karak 8 Peaks. There was a mighty Gorog, or binge-drinking celebration, that took place in the Great Hall, as the two holds at long last had something to bring them joy. Despite many projects coming to fruition over the last 15 years for Vala Azrael Ungol, such as the gyrocopter launch pads safely constructed, or the repairing of the Eastern Wall, endless war continued against the Skaven and the treacherous Skarsnik. Meanwhile, over in Karak Azul, an unspeakable crime had been committed against King Cazador by Gorfang Rotgut. Belegar felt genuine joy at seeing the ancient Karaks reconnected, though it would be false to claim all was merry. Cazador's absence from the ceremony was quite notable, though expected, as the legendary Dragon Slayer had become dour and reclusive since the attack of Gorfang. Ironhammer couldn't help but reminisce on his own kin's suffering caused by the war boss, now known as the Squatter King of Blackcrag. One day, he swore, there would be a reckoning between him and that foul abomination. Once the grand celebration concluded, Belegar bid his distant kin farewell as they departed for home, with the comfort of knowing that now both holds had the ability to trade in relative safety compared to the surface routes. Over the next 5 years, things would continue as the Dawi of Karak 8 Peaks had come to expect. Slow expansions followed up immediately by reinforcement, as Belegar sought to claim more territory, especially in the lower deeps. However, this proved to be an agonizing process, as Snik had quite the vivid imagination for unexpected schemes and traps. The heir of Lun excelled at predicting and countering most of these ploys, but even a successful defense against ambush assaults cost Belegar valuable dwarfen lives. Even if only a handful of the Groby scum's plots bore fruit, the Goblin Warlord had an endless tide of minions with which to experiment new tactics. Every few months, some bizarre breed of exploding squig or cleverly concealed stone trolls hiding among the debris would result in the Dawi losing valuable ground. Belegar could see they were winning the war, but the price for each step was truly grim. Dwarves are nothing if not tenacious, however, and occasional reinforcements from all around the old world continued to arrive and bolster Clan Angren's ranks. This included the remainder of his own clan joining him from Karaz Ankor, led by Belegar's brother. Although it would no doubt be hard, Belegar knew he could grind through this attrition until victory. But then, the war changed. The Skaven had always been a notable presence beneath Vala Ungol, but their cowardly nature and possession of the deepest levels kept them from being a true threat in Belegar's mind. Roughly around the Imperial calendar year of 2517, the Ratmen suddenly emerged from the darkness in a sudden shift in tactics. The heir of Lun found himself woken in the night and rushed out to find his Karak in chaos, as Skaven swarmed every possible entrance with reckless abandon. Donning his armor with practiced efficiency and taking up his hammer, Belegar rushed out to the surface city and scanned the situation. Fires raged and dwarf bodies lined the road as furry figures charged towards the citadel. Enraged by the wanton destruction before him, the king barreled forwards and laid into the oncoming vermin. Such was his wrath that he failed to notice when the Skaven soldiers changed from being pathetic creatures wearing rags to fully armored hulks with black fur. Even surrounded by their wicked halberds, however, he would not yield, the hammer of Angren crushing skulls within helmets, while the shield of defiance turned aside each desperate strike. Moments later, the crunching of armor and squeals of rodents announced the arrival of the Iron Brotherhood, as the king's personal guard butchered their way forward. Reinforced by his hammerers, Belegar's forces quickly put the Skaven to rout. An uneasy peace settled once more on the valley, the heir of Lun staring at the dead scattered about. Immediately, he summoned his war council and advisors as reports poured in from all over the citadel and lower deeps. Something had galvanized the Skaven into an all-out assault, and while the dwarves had weathered the storm, the abruptness was disturbing. Those rangers and scouts who tracked the Groby returned that day as well, bringing news of how numerous orc and goblin camps had been completely overwhelmed by Thagaraki. Based on the weapons, creatures, and sheer numbers used in those reports, Belegar realized that the Greenskins had been the true target of the attack. His own warriors had faced many troops certainly, but those had been poorly organized and motley hordes. Even the armored brutes seemed like an assorted bunch, while the Urk had been destroyed by legions wearing scarlet red colors. One of the rangers presented the king with a symbol taken from an assassinated standard bearer, and Ironhammer grimly recalled it from his own book of grudges, seeing it scribed on the walls in the lowest depths. It seemed the pack known as Clan Moors were on the offensive, for the first time since Belegar had staked his claim in Karak 8 Peaks. Over the following year, the Skaven continued to escalate their assault on all of Vala Ungol without pause or mercy. Belegar fought where he could, and rallied his warriors as it became steadily apparent that this battle was evolving into a bizarre siege. The Skaven would only pause for days at most, before a fresh assault of sickly wretches would swarm in to attack in their hundreds, followed up by the true meat of the attack. Many brave Dawi died defending their home, despite all the defensive preparations that the dwarfs' greatest minds had prepared. Although each death pained Ironhammer, none would grieve him so much as when his own brother was slain in battle. Those few survivors who had fled the disastrous engagement with the Ratmen reported seeing his brother dueling against a large Skaven who bore a grotesque trophy rack on its back and wielded a wicked-looking maul. As the siege of Karak 8 Peaks dragged on and the Skaven grew bolder, the death toll continued to rise. Most disturbing to the king, however, was that many of his greatest warriors began to fall amidst the battles raging for the hold. Each one died to the same beast, the apparent champion and leader of the Skaven, who came to be dubbed as the Head Taker for his morbid habit of decapitation. Although Belegar wanted nothing more than to seek out and destroy this foe, his advisors and wife were quick to remind him of his kingly oaths, to protect and lead his people. Vengeance upon this head taker, apparently named Queek as chanted by his rat-kin soldiers, would have to wait. To make matters worse, as the siege entered its third year, it became apparent that the Greenskins and Skaven were beginning to work together. Whether this was intentional or merely Skarsnik taking advantage of the situation was impossible for Belegar to tell, but he had desperately hoped the two would ground each other down instead. Although the night goblins would often backstab their occasional allies and vice versa, ultimately the weight of these combined assaults began to crack Belegar's defenses. He was a mighty warrior and had no doubts about the bravery of his kin, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Meanwhile, he already had been informed that the Ratmen were camping along the mountain slopes to shoot down any gyrocopters attempting to leave or enter, and a combined force had managed to fight its way into the underway and were blockading any aid coming from Karak Azul. They were completely encircled by an endless foe, and no messengers had arrived bearing news of reinforcements from any of the other holds. Although Belegar was far too stubborn to even entertain the notion, he could see that despair was growing in his people. For many, this siege bore too many signs of the infamous war millennia ago that had originally caused the abandonment of Karak 8 Peaks. The heir of Lund knew there would be at least one difference, however. No matter how grim things became, unlike his ancestor, he would never abandon his home. They would die defending it. As the weeks dragged on, and the dwarfs were pushed back bit by bit, Belegar began to draw up plans for a final stand, when at long last, help arrived. The king shot out of his throne as he heard harsh horns blaring from outside. A peculiar sound he had only heard back when he was a ward of Karaz Ankor. Hope blossomed beneath his white beard as he rushed past his confused guards and out the citadel's main gates to look out upon the valley. Looking past the east gate and the countless hordes surrounding Karak 8 Peaks, he spied a massive throng charging forward. Snapping in the wind above their heads, he could just make out a familiar sigil and grinned as his hopes were confirmed. Ungrim Ironfist had come. He could only raise his fist in triumph as a roaring line of slayers emerged ahead of the main army. Among their frenzied number, it was all too easy to spot the Slayer King in his legendary armor, considering the half-naked warriors surrounding him. While perhaps even the greatest throng of Karaz Ankor would have paused or been nervous at the sight of so many Skaven and Greenskins, to the Slayers, this was the greatest gift they could ask for. Belegar swelled with grim pride as he observed many of the berserkers reclaim their honor as they were felled by warp lightning, glowing bullets, or poisoned arrows, but slowed not one step. Crashing into the undisciplined hordes, the throng of Karak unleashed hell. Not one to miss a good runk, the king of Karak 8 Peaks rallied what troops he could spare, and led them charging out of the east gate. When the sun finally set over the horizon, the two kings met at the center of the battlefield, surrounded by Skaven and Greenskin dead. The siege of Vala Azrael was broken. After a brief conversation between the two, in which Ungrim expressed his sour disappointment at failing to meet his doom yet again, the two parted ways with mutual respect. The Slayer King was needed elsewhere as ever. Most of the remaining Slayers chose to stay at Karak 8 Peaks to seek their doom, thankfully providing the hold with quite the replenishment of warriors, who were all too ready for endless war. After the second siege of Karak 8 Peaks, the war for the hold descended once more into a free-for-all between the three factions competing for dominance. Now that he had Queek's measure, King Belegar swiftly adapted his defenses and tactics to account for the aggressive warlord during the lull after Ungrim's arrival. Where the Skaven hoped to exploit their limitless chaff infantry, Ironhammer carefully constructed his defenses around narrow bridges and sharp corners in the depths. Traps were rigged up around seemingly abandoned tunnels, and runes were etched onto thick doors to protect from fire and lightning siege weapons. Although Headtaker would prove to be just as deadly and dangerous as Skarsnik, a fragile excuse for peace did return to Karak 8 Peaks. For the next year, life resumed to a semblance of normalcy for the Dwarfs, despite the occasional secret mine being overrun by Queek or the Groby capturing some unfortunate scout to torture. Life was simply dangerous in Vala Azrael and quite harsh. This was reflected best by Belegar, who despite his immense pride and stubbornness, felt the attrition wearing him down. Yet all his fatigue, worry, and doubts were casually destroyed when a few simple words were uttered to him by Queen Kemma. She was pregnant. Belegar's heart soared as he embraced his beloved wife at the news. He was to be a father. Elated beyond words, the normally dour king could do little more than laugh. Not since his great victory during the battle for the citadel had he felt such joy. Quickly regaining his composure, the king and queen called for the Dawi of the hold to gather so that they might announce the pregnancy. As Ironhammer's rare grin greeted the audience, he proudly told his kin that there would be a true heir to Karak 8 Peaks at last. To say this caused excitement among the dwarves would be a gross understatement. A grand celebration was held, and Belegar stepped forward to reaffirm an old oath of his, but with a small addition. He would reclaim all of Karak 8 Peaks, so that his child would inherit a great hold free from Groby and Thagraki. With a familiar flame burning in his eyes, King Belegar was resolute that he would see this done. With a future to fight for, the dwarves serving the heir of Lund tackled their efforts to reclaim the hold with renewed vigor. Ironhammer himself personally led numerous excavations to clear out small portions of the deeps and scout out enemy lairs. This was made a fair bit easier by the noted reduction of Skaven found in the lowest depths. It seemed that for whatever reason, the Headtaker and his legions had marched out to fight elsewhere. Not one to pass up an opportunity, the dwarves quickly began scouting the former Thagraki territory for anything useful. It was during this time, however, that an unfortunate piece of news arrived for the king. 3 shipments full of precious gold bound for Karak 8 Peaks from Karaz Ankor had never arrived. A message sent by the High King soon arrived afterwards, inquiring about the very same convoy. Belegar could feel a creeping concern as he sent his own message detailing that the wagons had not been seen. With how dangerous Death Pass was becoming as of late, he wouldn't dare send rangers after those responsible right now, He needed every available warrior here. When Thorgrim's response arrived, it was delivered by a reckoner named Dwarf Grimlander. He had been sent to collect reparations for the Oxentongue clan, who had been delivering the gold when they had been ambushed. Only one survivor had escaped with much of the gold, and told what had happened to the High King before venturing north to take the Slayer Oath. According to his tale, the ambush occurred on the southern portion of the pass, and therefore Karak 8 Peaks was responsible. Belegar was indignant at this accusation, and with barely contained anger gave his response to the glorified debt collector. He would not be held responsible for the convoy in any way, as according to his scouts, the ambush had occurred instead on the northern side of the pass. Not a single coin would part Karak 8 Peaks for this unjust debt. While the other 8-peak Dawi grumbled in assent, the Reckoner's face reddened at the boldness of this declaration. It did not take long afterwards for all aid being sent to Vala Azrael to be cut off, though Belegar did not tell anyone why. Only those sworn to secrecy in his personal retinue knew otherwise, but rations began to grow thin, as trade from the south dried up as well. Word arrived that some series of events had finally caused King Khazador of Karak Azul to launch an all-out assault on Blackcrag. Fully committed to this new war, the Ironhold couldn't afford to spare any aid to Karak 8 Peaks until the Red Fang tribe was defeated and Gorfang Rotgut slain. Realizing he had little choice, Belegar ordered his cousin Belegar Hammerfist to immediately enact rationing so that their supplies might last. This would hopefully allow them to survive at least until trade routes reopened. For 15 long months, the Dawi of Vala Azrael struggled not to starve, even as news trickled in from all over that ominous signs were appearing, promising another age of warfare on the horizon. These portents of doom meant little to Belegar, focused as he was on expanding his realm, with those efforts being rewarded when some mercenaries exploring the depths found an untapped seam of silver. Ironhammer quickly negotiated a settlement with the wandering dwarves, and not only compensated them for their find, but also bought their silence on the discovery. Saddled with a fair amount of riches, the adventurers quickly departed and fled north, as word had arrived about how Death Pass was becoming incredibly crowded with Urk, drawn by the siege of Blackcrag. Despite this, the king could not have been more elated by a substantial silver vein being discovered at long last in his hold. Although they attempted to mine it quietly at first, the pace was so agonizingly slow that Belegar decided to risk drawing Skarsnik's attention, and ordered a full operation be set up to speed things along. Unfortunately, before he could begin to enjoy the fruit of his new silver mine, word arrived that the Reckoner, Dwarf Grimlander, had returned. Dreading another meeting with the envoy, Belegar slowly made his way out of Karag Monar. Arriving on the slopes that led into the new silver mine, he quickly found the surface city in disarray instead of celebrating Remembrance Day as it should have been. Ironhammer was briefed by his hammerers, who had been standing guard, that Skaven Jezzails had opened fire on the festivities, but were already being hunted down by gyrocopters. Before he could consider whether to join the chase, a piercing dwarf horn cried out from the east gate. The series of notes indicated a call for arms, and Belegar quickly glanced through some binoculars to see the trees of the forest just past the wall shaking. Cursing incessantly, he gathered his guard along with Duergar and immediately began his descent. Despite the treacherous footing offered when sliding down the scree slopes, Belegar made excellent time joining his gathering throng at the east gate. The entire garrison had gathered, and moments later followed their king out to battle. Some traveling wagons and several fleeing dwarves were being pursued by a large force of goblins, who were rallied around a few gigantic spiders crawling through the trees. Ironhammer eagerly charged out the instant the great door opened, butchering his way through Groby with the Eastgate garrison and Lord Duergar behind him. That was until he looked up at the wagon and locked eyes with his wife, Queen Kemma. Seeing his love surrounded by goblins awoke a deep and terrible fear in Belegar, shortly followed by nothing short of a berserker's rage. He lowered his horned helm and barreled through the enemy line without pause until he arrived at the wagons. With a line of twitching goblin corpses behind him, the king of Karak 8 Peaks struggled to remain calm while arguing with his wife before noticing that the Groby were fleeing up the trees en masse. At first, he assumed they had been broken by his bull charge, but that notion was quickly put to rest as a massive contingent of hammerers came marching into view. Belegar turned to face the oncoming dwarf throng just as the garrison caught up with him to greet the unexpected visitors. The Dawi just kept coming, however, and Ironhammer grew deeply concerned at the sheer size of the army present. This throng was far too massive for anything short of a king. No, a high king. Panicked, he quickly turned to Duergar and ordered his cousin to prepare the citadel for guests, as banners bearing the sigil of Karaz Ankor came into view. Just as Lord Hammerfist vanished behind the open gate, the unmistakable shape of the throne of power emerged from the tree line. Thorgrim Grudgebearer had come to Karak 8 Peaks. Ironhammer stood resolute as the High King of the Dwarfs stepped down from his glorious throne, carrying the Great Book of Grudges carefully tucked underneath one arm, and approached. Only Belegar and Kemma did not kneel, though the latter due to being physically unable, as she was swollen with child. The king of Karak 8 Peaks welcomed the ruler of Everpeak to his hold, but quickly felt the sting of Thorgrim's tone, as the High King remarked how poorly Karak 8 Peaks seemed to be handling the Urk on its lands. Belegar's face tinged red, and the two kings immediately began to exchange barbed remarks as if throwing punches. Grudgebearer eventually revealed he had come to slay Gorfang Rotgut, for the Squatter King had apparently left Karak Draz to rally more troops. He expected to use Karak 8 Peaks as a base of operations for his forces, to which Belegar swiftly remarked that he would not be a humbled quartermaster. If there was going to be a war on his lands, then Ironhammer would be at its center. To this, the High King remarked that perhaps if Karak 8 Peaks would not properly offer itself to assist, then he should reclaim what was owed from the supposedly secret silver mines. Belegar's rage swelled as Thorgrim revealed he had happened across the adventurers who had discovered the silver veins in the first place, for he had been interrogating those from Vala Azra-Ongol, in suspicion of how casually Ironhammer had allowed and practically forced the cessation of trade. Ignoring his wife, who was furious at the reveals, Belegar stomped forwards until he was practically beard to beard with Thorgrim. Accusations and grudges were exchanged between them in an escalating fashion until Grudgebearer warned the heir of Lun of having his name inscribed in the Damaskron yet again. He once again demanded, this time, that Belegar allow them into the hold, but Ironhammer simply grinded his teeth and crossed his arms. This was a matter of pride now. He would not allow anyone to belittle or command him in his own hold. Finally, the two kings settled on having a Damazuk, a trial of grudges. Although tempted to leave the Dawi of Everpeak outside, even Belegar wouldn't allow Dawi to be slain by this skittering tree groby due to his sheer stubbornness. He gestured for the throng of Karaz Ankor to enter, and preparations for the Damazuk were made immediately. The dwarves of both holds gathered upon the flagstones of Vel Divor, where earlier that day the celebration for Remembrance Day had been held until Skaven gunners had opened fire. Dried blood was still on the ground, and many of the East Gate garrison disheveled from the recent battle, as the High Priestess of Valea, Magda Freydaughter, arrived to oversee the trial of grudges. Queen Kemma retired from the scene, irritated at the stubbornness of both sides, while Lord Duergar, reunited with many of his clan Akron kin who had arrived from Everpeak, marched off to defend the East Gate. Shortly afterwards, the Damazuk began, as the Dawi of Karaz Ankor and Karak 8 Peaks began hashing out grudges and angry debates. Belegar paced impatiently by the well that centered the courtyard, glaring daggers at the High King upon the throne of power. With the High Priestess of Alea present to ensure they were telling the absolute truth, the two kings sternly stared one another down. Never known for his patience, Belegar couldn't remain silent for long, and laid into Thorgrim with his grudges. Before the High King could respond with his own, however, the King of Karak 8 Peaks found his eyes drawn to a glowing boulder hurtling towards the east wall. Ironhammer's jaw gaped as he watched the trajectory of the massive flaming rock arc towards the recently rebuilt part of the wall. Although it had been repaired since Belegar destroyed it years ago, the Dwarfs of Vala Azrael hadn't possessed the skill or time to repair it properly. Instead, the engineers and stonemasons had done the best they could and disguised the weaker portion. Or so they had hoped. The projectile was a perfect shot and slammed directly into the eastern wall's weakest link, smashing open a gaping wound in an explosion of flame and rock. As Belegar stared in disbelief, thousands of greenskins roared from atop a hill and charged towards the breach. His hold was under attack. The King of Karak 8 Peaks grabbed the Hammer of Angrund and prepared for battle, but found himself prevented from joining by the sage council of Thorgrim. Grudgebearer knew an attack had been coming. He revealed that Gorfang himself was likely behind the attack. The High King declared that they should wait here, allow Lord Duergar and his kin to hold the walls, and funnel the greenskins into the city past the wall, where the Dawi of both armies could easily crush the Squatter King's forces. Although it pained Belegar to admit it, Thorgrim's plan made a fair amount of sense, and so all he could do was pace as the fighting began. Minutes passed with no word from the front, and each second proved to be agony on Ironhammer's soul. He should be on the front line, leading his warriors in combat against the enemy. The only thing that brought him solace was that Queen Kemma should have been safe in Kivin Weir by then, as she had departed before the Damazuk began. He continued to argue with Thorgrim about holding back, though the High King remained unmoved. Finally, an exhausted messenger arrived and explained the situation. The Urk had used magic to breach the wall in several places, and were attempting to pour through the holes. Duergar Hammerfist's forces were containing those that entered the city proper, but Belegar noted that it seemed an unusual amount of fighting was taking place at the walls. Someone had rallied much of the Eastgate garrison there, so if not his cousin, then who was in command? The clan's dwarf meekly hung his head and asked if they noticed the war cry coming from the gate. Feeling an icy concern creep into his heart, Ironhammer carefully listened and heard one word faintly in the distance. Vala. They were shouting Vala. Queen. Without a moment's hesitation, Belegar ripped the chunk of silver ore from his pocket and hurled it directly at Thorgrim's head. Not waiting for a response, he tore the Hammer of Angrund from his thigh and charged from the square towards the battle. Kemma was in danger. The King of Karak 8 Peaks ran with haste only those gripped by mortal fear can manage, tearing his way towards the east gate until he arrived upon the edge of the battle. Despite the dwarf line falling back with broken shields and spent quivers, they were still fighting hard for every inch of earth the orcs attempted to claim. Casting his gaze across the bloody conflict for any sign of his wife, Ironhammer plunged into the maelstrom of violence and tore ruin through his enemies. He hardly noticed the greenskins he slew as his desperate search for the queen continued until he finally spied her crown. She was surrounded by heavily armored brutes, only a thin line of brave Dawi remaining between her and the enemy. Belegar surged towards her, butchering anything in his path, but realized he would be too late as a colossal orc came charging towards those remaining dwarves. Gorfang Rotgut had arrived at last. Belegar's heart stiffened with fear as he saw the orc warboss collide with the dwarves like a cannonball, hurling bearded corpses in all directions. Although they put up a desperate last stand, all the warriors defending Kemma were swiftly cut down or tossed aside with casual effort by the Troll Eater. She stood alone. Belegar felt fury swell within him. His muscles hardened, his blood turning hot until his skin blistered. A long, wordless roar of a challenge rushed through his ears, and without realizing it, he was charging. It was as if a crimson wave had crashed over his shoulders and flung him through the full Urk standing in the path of the Ironhammer. Through the red mist, he saw Gorfang turn, leer, lower his sword, and raise one massively gauntleted fist to gesture, "Come on." Summoning the wrath of all his ancestors, Belegar leapt for the giant Urk, unleashing a frenzy of blows too savage for any creature of flesh to counter. The Ironhammer left a string of craters across Gorfang's breastplate. The brute himself was left staggered but unhurt, and swinging an arm that Belegar ducked, then sprung up behind to attack again. The Ironhammer glowed brighter and hotter, the rune weapon dragging his arm to strike ever faster. It was like fighting with a lightning bolt rather than a hammer. Gorfang fell back, the grin well and truly beaten from his face, and Belegar exploited every inch he took. A diagonal swipe crushed a pauldron, a thrust stamped the rune of Angrund into Gorfang's breastplate, and then a blistering uppercut forced the orc into a parry, taking the blow on his fist, flinging the Urk's arm back and spinning the two fighters apart in a hail of sparks. Belegar shook his head and stood in time to meet the fist coming the other way. Instinctively he raised his shield, the blow cracking the steel rim against his cheekbone and throwing him back. It was like being hit by a tree. He hit the stones and rolled, coming up swinging, the Ironhammer dashing aside Red Fang's thrust. But the Urk was quicker than he looked, taking another dent to his thick plate as he spun and whacked his sword across the side of Belegar's helm. The Gromro craft of the Ancients spared Belegar the worst, but his head rang like the barrel of a fired cannon. He stumbled back, head filled with deep laughter until he could fumble out the straps and tear the helm from his face. Fresh air bit his bare cheeks as he blinked to clear his vision of stars, and the Urk was still chuckling. Belegar felt the ancestral rage that had driven him seep away. He had felt as though he was revenge incarnate, but now he was just one dwarf, alone, faced with an Urk who took his hammer's bruises as though they were wrapped knuckles. "This is the last time you cross the airs of Eight Peaks, Gorfang, and I am not my cousin. I will not settle merely for an eye," Belegar said. Gorfang laughed, jumping through another hammer blow with a downward sweep of his sword that ripped through a layer of chain to send iron ringlets raining before Belegar could get out of the way. He came on. A dead boar lay in his path. He kicked it, lifting the huge body off the ground and towards Belegar. Gorfang thumped his dented breastplate and roared with laughter as Belegar stumbled clear of the rolling corpse. He rubbed his iron eye patch. "I remember that Zoggin cheat. It took him and all his boys to get this off me. What have you got, stunty?" Belegar felt wall at his back. He had been driven right back to the homes of Karen Vard. He gripped his hammer with fresh resolve. There could be no more retreating. And then, like a force of nature, Gorfang dropped his shoulder and charged. The impact was like being caught in an avalanche. Belegar was ripped from the ground and driven through the wall with the great Urk following right behind. Winded, Belegar mouthed an oath, threw a punch at Gorfang's iron eye patch in one last act of defiance, before he was flung to the ground and booted across the room. He was weightless for a moment, then he crashed into an interior wall, and fell flat on his face onto a bed of rubble. There was blood in his mouth. With the last of his stamina, Belegar rolled onto his back. At least he'd see death coming, and that was something. More at least than Skarsnik or the Head Taker had ever offered. A king is gonna die today, Stunty, and I think you've got it coming. Belegar set his jaw and met Gorfang's one eye. He didn't know who was the more surprised when a hammer swung from nowhere and near decapitated the Urk with a blow to the side of the head that threw him sideways and face first into the wall. Had his neck not been as thick as an iron stanchion, the strength of the blow would have almost certainly tore his head off. Belegar prayed to Grimnir that Gorfang felt it enough to stay down for at least a few minutes. Kemma stood where the Urk had been, her weapon squashed beyond repair following its encounter with Gorfang's skull. The king and queen exchanged loving, though curt words, as they prepared to move on with the 3 other surviving Dawi around them. Before they could so much as turn, however, Gorfang awoke and like a drunken giant stumbled back to his feet. The heir of Lun stepped in front of Kemma and raised his hammer for one last battle. As the king of Black Crag stomped towards them, however, Belegar spied something glinting behind the orc and smiled. Seconds later, a loud twang rang out, and Rotgut's taunting was interrupted as a bolt thrower's spear punched through his chest. The Troll Eater glared down at it before collapsing, the floor buckling under his immense weight, and the Urk vanished from sight into the darkness below. Although the king of Black Crag had been defeated, there was still an entire Wa bearing down on Karak 8 Peaks, and the 5 dwarfs couldn't afford to stay put. Belegar quickly led them to the nearest intact shop by the wall, and they barricaded the door just as swarms of Crooked Moon night goblins swarmed up from all over to join the battle. It seemed that Skarsnik had finally taken a notice of things. Ironhammer knew that Dudergar and Thorgrim could handle themselves, however, and quickly did what he could to comfort his wife while clutching her hand. It was quite apparent that his son had decided he would be born now, regardless of the danger at hand. By the time morning arrived, Belegar held his beautiful baby boy in his arms alongside his wife. The battle had ended, and Thorgrim's army had put the greenskin filth to rout. Not to mention, the High King had personally slain Gorfang in a duel. All Dawi across the Karaz Ankor had cause to celebrate, for the Squatter King was dead, and Vala Azrael had her prince. Hope, at long last, had returned to the Dwarven realms. Although hard times laid ahead, Belegar took comfort in knowing his line was secure, and the clans of Karak 8 Peaks could fight all the harder to secure a glorious realm for their future king, Thorgrim Ironhammer of Clan Angrand. With the death of Gorfang, the Greenskin army was in complete disarray, and the Dawi intended to take full advantage of it. Now was their chance to end the siege of Karak 8 Peaks and deal a serious blow to their foes. The High King commenced the attack by forcing passage through the Karagnar gates, while King Belegar drove out of the fortified citadel. The fighting was fierce, with axe and hammer pitted against stabbing spears and squig teeth. The fire of the dwarves' anger was hotter, however, and the presence of the High King turned the tide. The dwarves cleared the first 2 levels of Karak 8 Peaks, their forces advancing towards the Great Hall. But Skarsnik, the leader of the Crooked Moon tribe, emptied his reserves, sending forth wave after wave of attackers. Amidst the forest of shattered pillars, the fighting raged for 3 blood-soaked days. Through sheer determination, the dwarves won the Great Hall, captured the Crooked Moon standard, and cast down the idol the Greenskins summoned to aid them. Yet the dwarves did not have the numbers to hold their gains. Although it grieved them, the dwarves burnt their dead behind them, and force-marched back to their starting positions before the Greenskins could recover, or the Skaven joined the fray. After the Battle of Karak 8 Peaks, Thorgrim and his army left to finish off the forces defending Blackcrag. The two kings parted on joyous terms, and both agreed to resume trade immediately. With rumors of Queek Headtaker's return and his son to defend now on his mind, the heir of Lun wished the High King luck but remained home to continue fighting. He had much to do to fulfill his oath of reclaiming his realm before Thorgrim came of age. A few months later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the gates of Karak 8 Peaks to assist in this fighting. With the siege of Kalakdraz now over, Thorik Ironbrow had returned at the head of a mighty throng to assist in the recapturing of Vala Azral Ungol's many hidden relics. Not to mention check in upon the young prince, who had been born in the same battle in which Gorfang Rotgut had been slain. Belegar gladly welcomed in his old ally and advisor, joining the Rune Lord in various expeditions into the deepest and darkest parts of Karak 8 Peaks for battle against their eternal foes. With the mightiest living Rune Lord reaping a terrible toll with his Anvil of Doom and forging new arms and armor, Ironhammer knew it was only a matter of time before he would at last defeat Skarsnik and the Headtaker. No one could deny that a new age was upon the Dwarfs, an age of hope.